I'm so excited. I have two of my very favorite authors here with me this evening and two of my favorite series, which have been going on for a really long time. Jim, what book are you on?
This is number 14.
Wow. And you are?
You caught up with me.
I
I'm 14
know.
too.
Right. I think that they write, it's, I don't want to call it military fiction because I think that pigeonholes it. It is, but I think it's much broader than that. So I think of it as historical fiction. I think of them as thrillers. It's a whole lot of, I think it's a mistake to label things. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, because there's also a lot of character in both books. So there's character development, there's characters who have something to teach us, and that goes beyond any label of crime fiction or historical fiction.
Well, when my first book in the series came out back in 1992, I would tell people it's part of a subgenre called the military mystery procedural. And at the time, I was the king of that subgenre, the only one. Now all these guys like him, what are you gonna do?
It's interesting that war theaters are kind of a gift that gives on giving to authors. I mean, we're in the middle of this enormous resurgence of World War II stories as we keep finding new facets of World War II that haven't been explored. And Martin's genius, I think, is to take the American troops and the whole experience of them being in Korea and make it very much like a World War II story. It's just they're not actually at war, but they're an occupying force, right?
Right.
So you've kind of caught up to Jim, who is now in occupied France, except the bad guys. We're trying to drive them out, whereas in your books, the Americans, although it's curious how many of the Americans turn out to be the bad guys in your books.
It's never that clear in Martin's books.
No.
Who's good? Who's a good guy? Who's a bad guy?
Yeah, well, if you figured it out, explain it to me. It's funny you should mention that because World War II, which I don't write about, he does, but my dad was at Pearl Harbor. He passed away almost 2 years ago now. When he was 17, a sailor, he's on a small transport ship, and then he went out in the South Pacific and all that happened. But he spent the rest of his life reading books about World War II because so much had happened that he didn't know about it. Not only that, they didn't even tell you that. It didn't appear in the newspapers. Things were classified. So he spent the whole rest of his life. He always had a book about World War II, whatever was the latest, whatever he could get his hands on. And sometimes he'd see, okay, I was at that island and we were near that battle, or we were at that. And you spend your whole life studying it, and you're still going to have so much more to know.
And that, same with me. My dad was in the war and was in India, China, India theater. And same thing, he just read about the Civil War and World War II. He was always sitting at the kitchen table at night with a cup of coffee, reading a history book. And I think that just sort of stuck with me.
Well, it was a global war. I mean, the scope of it was enormous. You had the European theater, you had the Pacific theater, you had Burma, you had Africa. I mean, every part of the world really contributed in its own and different way to all of those stories. You only once had gone to the Pacific theater so far.
I could only figure out one way to get Billy there that didn't strain credulity. So, but you never know.
It's one of your best books. I thought your whole, for those who haven't read it, it's his book about John F. Kennedy and other things. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. In 2 years, we're going to the Soviet Union, so that'll stretch us.
Well, that'll be topical. Go to the Ukraine, which
It
at
is
that
actually
point
set in
was.
Ukraine.
I know. Yep. And I think that, one of the things I think is so fascinating about Martin's books is the juxtaposition of the American culture and the Korean culture, how they clash, but also how they figure out how to kind of get along.
Right. I mean, when I was stationed there in the 1968, when I first went there, I was telling Jim it was like almost like a feudal society at that time. I mean, it wasn't just backward; it was like going back in time. The oxen would pull the plows. People naturally work in the fields. They wear hemp cloth clothing with straw hats, and the houses looked like little mud hovels, but they were covered in straw thatch, not even tile or iron or tin or anything. And I felt like I was jumped into a Brothers Grimm story. It's like going back to the Middle Ages. You know, they had virtually, they were occupied by the Japanese for 35 years, 1910, 45, and Japan was basically taking wealth out of the country all that time. They did build roads, they built railroads, they built ports, but that was to extract mineral wealth and to extract rice. All the rice went to the Japanese army during the war,
As did women.
Oh yeah, the comfort women.
Yeah.
And
Japanese had a very bad record in Korea.
the Koreans still believe that they fired the first shots of World War II because their freedom fighters, who mainly operated up in Manchuria, they had whole battalions that later joined Chairman Mao after the war, and they would come down and fight the Japanese. But the Japanese were very efficient at fighting insurrections, what we would call guerrilla warfare. They were brutal, so they would wipe out villages and so on and so forth, and they used other Koreans to do their intelligence gathering. So basically, those efforts to retake the country were completely ineffective. Kim Il-sung, meanwhile, the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, he was an officer in the Soviet army stationed across the border in the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, his son, Kim Jong-il, his first language was Russian. He was born in Russia. They won't say that in their propaganda. And their propaganda is that Kim Il-sung kicked the Japanese out of Korea, which is nonsense. The Japanese left Korea as part of their total surrender. They had to withdraw from all the colonies that they had. Anyways, don't get me started.
Wasn't Korea a kingdom up until the
Yeah.
Japanese? I thought.
Right to the beginning of the 20th
So
century.
really
Right to
was-
the beginning of the 20th century.
Right. So feudal is not an inappropriate
Not an
adjective.
exaggeration. No.
Yeah, very much so. I had when I was working on my master's at Northwestern, I was the department secretary in the chemical engineering department, which was like Russian to me. Well, actually, I spoke Russian, so it wasn't like Russian to me, but something else. And he was a Korean that, we're talking what are we talking here? 65.
When the Russians were in North Korea?
Well, he was a
They-
Korean, a professor
Uh-huh.
at Northwestern University, but he was a Korean first generation, Korean immigrant, and had a family. And I remember once I was invited home for dinner, and it was really fascinating, the family structure. So that's a little bit.
Well, the Russians
So
took
you
over
came along,
North
that's all I
Korea.
knew about Korea.
Yeah, the Russians occupied North Korea in 1945.
Was it there?
Yeah, that's when they took the north half and the U.S. took the southern half of the country. That's when it was divided. And they kept the troops there. The Russian generals are the ones who chose Kim Il-sung. He was not necessarily their first choice. But some of the other choices are people who actually had soldiers and battalions and administrative organizations. They were actual real revolutionaries. But they decided not to choose them because they didn't want anybody with a power base. Kim Il-sung was just hanging around, and they knew he had a certain charisma, and so they appointed him. But he didn't have any real political experience. But they taught him too about how to be a dictator. The Soviets did that.
Yeah, it's fascinating that one can't foresee the consequences of moves like that. It's often said in regard to what you're writing that if Patton had made it to Berlin, it would have been completely different, the balance of power after the war. But when Roosevelt was so ill, everything just sort of went static, and so he didn't make it.
And even if he had, he might have had to give it back.
Yep.
Which is, the themes keep coming. We just gave one of our bases where we left the Kurds. Russians just did a propaganda video about how they've taken it over. And the same thing probably would have happened then because they keep getting the best of us somehow.
Or we just keep giving it away, but let's not talk about that. You have succeeded in landing in France in the last book, and moving along towards occupying Paris. So the thrust of your new book, which I think is a really interesting title, When Hell Struck 12, it's from a poem that you put in the front of the book, right?
Yes, and if it's time for true confessions, I have to tell you, I often look to poetry for a title, because I like a title, I like to get it ahead of time when I first start writing, and it's something that has something to do with the theme of the book. So I found this French 19th century poet, Arthur Rimbaud, who was completely nuts, just really real hallucinogenic, bizarre poetry, wonderful stuff. So I found a website that had all this poetry translated, and I found this line, when hell struck, the devil's in the tower right now, when the hell struck 12. And I thought, well, the devil in the tower, that's Hitler, hell striking 12, that's great. I told my publisher, they loved it. And the book went through all the rounds of editing it goes through, and at the very end, they give it to proofreaders. After all the editing and copy editing is done, they give it to a proofreader to find all the errors that crept in when you were editing. And this woman her job was not to look things up, but she happened to know French poetry. And she said, do you realize that the French version, this is an incorrect translation, in the real French poem, it's actually when the bell struck 12, which is the most uninspiring line you could imagine. So in the author's note, I kind of spin it a little bit that, I knew that. But I liked this mistranslation so much, and I thought Rimbaud would have approved it. He was that weird of a guy. He would have liked it. So we kept it in. But in reality, it was like at the last minute, what are we going to do?
It's a perfect title for your book.
It fits.
You don't have to be super accurate to Rimbaud, as we say. Anyway, the reason I brought up Patton was that he's a player in this book, and it's really fun to have you draw a picture of him because he was one of the. Who was the actor that George C. Scott, right, played Patton? So that's kind of a picture we have, but I think that your description of him and how he behaves in the book is just so much fun.
The thing I found out about Patton, he was a real gossip, social climber. He sort of, when he
Probably would
realized...
have tweeted if he'd been alive today.
Yeah, oh yeah, he would have had somebody tweet. But in this story, when he finds out that Billy is the nephew of General Eisenhower, it's all of a sudden, oh, well, tell your Uncle Ike I said hello. He was that kind of social climber and very adept at insinuating himself with the powerful. So it was too hard to resist. And he also had that flamboyant nature that he could put on a show.
And he dressed for it too. I love the way you described, how he was. You have people in mud and they've been shot at, and they haven't had a shower and they reek, and it's just horrible. Here comes George, with incredible polished boots and his perfectly pressed uniform, and
finding them for not wearing a tie.
Yes, very, very. Yeah, he must have been actually hell to work for, so to speak. But anyway, you've survived Falaise, and we're now sort of moving towards occupying Paris. But are we really moving towards occupying Paris, or is it a feint? It's an F-E-I-N-T, and we're going to go around occupied Paris and try. So, is that based on real fact?
It is, and one of the things I was looking for a way to come at the liberation of Paris in the novel, and when I realized and found out that the two people that probably should have wanted it to happen the most, General Eisenhower and General de Gaulle, neither of them wanted it to happen. We just had the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Paris in August, and in reality, the plan had been to go around it, to let the Germans sit there, because what Eisenhower wanted to do was chase the defeated German army into Germany and defeat them. And he didn't want to take the time or the resources to liberate Paris. And de Gaulle, he did want to go into Paris, but what happened, if you've seen the movie or read the book, Is Paris Burning, about the revolt, was not planned, that was pretty spontaneous. And the problem de Gaulle had with it was that the leader of the revolt in Paris was a communist. He was the head of the Free French Army, the French forces of the interior in the greater Paris area, but he was a member of a large communist organization. And the one thing that de Gaulle wanted not to have happen was for him to march into Paris and be greeted by the liberator of Paris, who was a communist and in control of the state apparatus. So they both were trying to tamp down this revolt and have it not happen. But events just took over, and they both reluctantly had to go ahead and liberate Paris. And I thought that's an interesting moral dilemma to wrap around this story.
It is the moral dilemma, but there's also a really genuine fear that the Germans would destroy Paris because they had laid waste to other places. And Paris, miraculously, they left without blowing it all, leaving it for today with the fire. But
Mostly so they could loot it to the last minute before they left.
yeah, but it was touch and go until they were finally driven out as to whether they would turn around and blow up Saint-Chapelle or something, so, because they had done terrible damage to, was Warsaw?
Warsaw had just been razed to the ground. The German commander of Paris, his nickname on the Eastern Front was the Beast of Sevastopol, because he had destroyed that city. So he knew what he was doing, but I think he did have a bit of conscience left and thought, Paris, that's a bit much. Maybe I shouldn't destroy Paris.
Maybe they were taking a long view that one day they might want to go back, right?
Or I think he was taking a long view towards writing his memoirs as the man who saved Paris.
The man who saved Paris. All right. So there's a really interesting general in your book, except we don't get to meet him. Well, he's more prominent in the end, but he's an American general.
I wrote it 2 years ago, so it's gonna take a few seconds to cause it.
There we go.
I wrote it 2
He's
years ago.
He's the general who's accused of bringing women of ill repute.
Oh, yeah.
Remember him?
Yeah. That's all you needed to say. It came back to me right away. Yeah, I have a Korean general up on the DMZ, and along the DMZ, you have the place like the JSA, Joint Security Area, where we just recently, President Trump met Kim Jong-il, and they even take tourists up there. You got to be careful, you follow the rules, but the tourists go up there. But that place is relatively accessible, especially now that they built the road. When I first got there, they didn't have a paved road going up there, but the DMZ stretches through a mountain range, the Taebaek Mountains, and up in those mountain ranges, you're very isolated up there, and so and they have a number of divisions. So I just had this division commander of Korean Army, who also happens to be a relative of some very powerful people, and he's sort of running his own little show up there, and a scandal develops where some women some MP who was an American MP who was designated to travel with these women in an army truck, and he helped transport them, and he contacts a reporter. Now over there, the Korean newspapers were totally controlled by the Park Chung-hee authoritarian militaristic government in South Korea. And also the U.S. paper is the Pacific Stars and Stripes. I worked for them briefly, and I know what it's like to get hammered down on a story. And when I was in the Army, I got to work for them. And I published a few byline articles when I was 19, and that's in that newspaper. And that's about 10 years ago.
So it's all fresh in your mind.
Yeah, but there was another, and the Stars and Stripes was printed in Tokyo, and these old, beautiful old teletype machines, these huge monstrosity things. But then they would take it every day by truck to the Yokota Air Force Base in Japan and ship it all around the Pacific, and to Vietnam. When we had the 500,000 troops down there. And a lot of guys all remember, anybody stationed there remembers the Stars and Stripes every day. You know, they have the Beetle Bailey cartoons in it, they have this and that. And everybody read the Stars and Stripes. It was the only newspaper you had, really. You could go to the Post Library, they had some that might have the New York Times and everything, but the one that was always available was the Stars and Stripes. But then they started a civilian newspaper called the Overseas Weekly. And the Overseas Weekly started in Germany. That's where we had the most troops before the Vietnam War really got going. And then when the 1966, a woman called Anne Bryan, who was a reporter for the Overseas Weekly, she traveled to Saigon and set up the, Far East branch of the Overseas Weekly. And they started printing an Asian edition in Hong Kong. And she was the only reporter at first. And she lived over a little French restaurant run by a Vietnamese woman and paid, next to nothing for rent. But she got her press credential and she could travel around just like the big star reporters could. And she started writing stories critical of the Army. One that I remember, it just stuck in my mind. I remember reading it because you'd see the Overseas Weekly around. Was they had brought back a combat engineer unit from the field where they were building things like protective revetments for artillery bases, that sort of thing. And brought them back in the field, and their job was to build a new tennis court for the officers' club. And you know that, by the way, the 1st Division had a 9-hole golf course at their headquarters. And they had 3 brigades of infantry. 2 brigades were out in the field. 1 brigade was surrounding the headquarters. If you don't believe me, read About Face by Colonel Hackworth. And he raised hell about all this, and they fired him from the Army. But the Overseas Weekly was always coming up with stories like this, and there was an abundance of them that never appeared in the Stars and Stripes. So in this story, when these gals get transported up to the division and these MPs have to transport them, she blows the whistle on it, and that causes my 2 investigators all kinds of, because one of the jobs they're trying with is they're trying to solve some bank robberies, and meanwhile they have to, the priority is to get this gal, I was going to use a worse word, but get her and shut her up. So that her name is Katie Bird Worthington. She's from the States. That's the character's name. And why is it GI Confidential? Because the Overseas Weekly, the GIs used to call it the Oversexed Weekly, because they always had pinup. Now the pinups were pretty tame by today's standards. They were just young models in bikinis. But in those days that was pretty wild. They didn't do that in the Stars and Stripes. So and I changed the name of to Overseas Observer in here, but it's anybody who lived through that time will know it was the Overseas Week.
I love the way you start out, and there's a spate of crimes, and I'm never sure whether it's going to be Koreans doing bad things or the American soldiers taking advantage of all the possibilities for corruption or ripping off Uncle Sam or so you start out with bank robberies that appear to be from the American military, right?
Well, my 2 young investigators, enlisted men, George Swing and Ernie Bascom, they have no doubt that it's GI's robot. But since it hasn't been proven, the 8th Army brass is saying, well, we don't know anything about this, we don't want it. And there had never been, as far as I know, there never has been a GI's robbed Korean bank. But hey,
As far as you know.
as far as I know. but also, I know the military is such a closed society. If any of you have been in the military, they don't advertise. It's not like say at the LA Times, they got a reporter who works the crime beat or multiple reporters, and they read a lot of reports every day. And there's very few crimes that go past them. They don't report on everything because most of it's routine crime, right? But something unusual they report on. And that goes for any city in the United States, and most of them Western Europe. But the Army doesn't put that stuff out. And there's no reporter on base to do it. That's what Overseas Weekly was doing. And they had press credentials. But anytime the Public Affairs Office feeds the press stuff, it's pablum. And what this gal was doing is she's making personal contacts with the GIs, and a lot of them can't wait to get their revenge on the Army by telling about something they know.
Well, you've got two guys who are always trying to buck the system. I mean, you know, it takes Basco and Swino to go against the brass, and they have their own standards. They can be violent, they can do a lot of things, but they have their own sense of justice. So they're really kind of like cowboys in some respects, you know, determined to. And they're forced into an alliance. I love Mr. Kill. He's one of my favorite characters.
Oh, yeah.
They're forced into an alliance oftentimes with Korean investigators and so forth because, you know, they can't.
Well, the Korean National Police
Right.
knows
KNP.
KNPs, and they don't. It's the only police force in Korea. They don't have local police forces, and it was set up that way in the Park Chung-hee regime so they could control the police. And he happens to be the chief homicide inspector of the Korean National Police. Now he's got his own bureaucratic problems, you know, stuff coming down, but things that he wants to look into, and he's got bureaucratic issues. So when he finally finds two American investigators who are independent, even though they're in the Army, but they're always in trouble, and that, like George Swinyo can speak Korean, Ernie has his own talents to being able to move amongst the underworld. And when he finally finds those two guys, he realizes their value. And he goes to, he's got some political influence himself. He's very high ranking. And he goes to someone in his government who contacts the American ambassador, who contacts the 8th Army commander, who contacts the provost marshal in charge of the MPs to say, send these two guys to him, they're on temporary duty with it. And nothing makes a bunch of American officers more angry than having their soldiers assigned to somebody else. And it happens sometimes, but that's exactly why Eisenhower was chief commander and not Montgomery, right? Because they knew better than to even think about putting a foreigner in charge of U.S. troops.
So you guys, I mean, the same problems that arise in Michael Connelly's books for Harry Bosch, where he really doesn't fit into the command structure of the LAPD, and he goes rogue some of the time and whatever. You know, that's a gift for both of you by working in the Army, because you can have all this conflict arising out of not just the crimes or not just the local populace or the war, but just in the military structure itself. So you come up with, I think your opening scene in this book, Jim, was particularly grim. I don't remember one quite so in any of your other books, but even D-Day didn't have that kind of. So what inspired you to give us this graphic portrait of the fight for this hill?
Well, there were two things, two reasons. One is sort of craft related, and when I do a lot of book talks, I often do a reading. And a few books ago, I realized it was hard to select a reading that I didn't need to explain too much about or that didn't give away a plot point. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll make the first chapter what I'm going to read. So it changed the whole feel of the book, because now I can't have a first chapter that sets the scene. The first chapter has to be action-oriented. It has to be a satisfying thing to read as an introduction, read to a group. So it sort of it built some momentum into the past few books, which changed it a little bit. But also, this particular stand, this was the Polish 1st Armored Division. It was fighting as part of the British Army at the moment. And they were tasked to hold on to a hill. It was the linchpin in this whole plan to capture and isolate half the German army in Normandy. And they were surrounded on this hill for 3 days, ran out of food, ran out of water, and were about to run out of ammunition when the last attack came up the hill against them. There were Germans that were in this trap fighting to get out. There were Germans on the outside trying to break in so their comrades could get out. And the Poles, you know, I have a Polish character. And the more I've learned about the Poles in World War II, they just took it on the chin every which way. They were the first to fight, maybe the Koreans, but they were attacked by both sides, literally. fought valiantly in the Battle of Britain. There were Polish fighter pilots. They were fighting in Europe. There were Polish divisions. And at the end of the war, in 1946, there was a victory parade organized by the Western Allies in London. And the Poles were not allowed to march. The same guys who helped save Britain in the early days had fought all along because we, the British and the Americans, had recognized the Soviet Poles as the government pole. So they got the short end of it. And this was an incredibly valiant stand. They lost 400 dead, 1,000 wounded, and it was at the same time that the Warsaw Uprising had just happened, we mentioned before. Warsaw had been razed to the ground. Tens of thousands of fighters and civilians were massacred. This was when the Soviets stood off. They were about to enter Warsaw. The Poles rose up, and the Soviets saw that as an opportunity to let any Polish resistance be wiped out by the Germans, so they wouldn't. So at the same time these guys are fighting on this hill, they know that their brothers and sisters in Warsaw are being massacred. And it just so happened that the Germans attacking them were SS. So it was the Battle of Warsaw on this little hill in France. And that just struck me as such a moment. And the way they turned back the attack, everything in that chapter happened the way it was described, was phenomenal. Horrible. And it just felt like that story had to be told, and I had to have my Polish guy Kaz be at the center.
Yeah, Cass has a very important role as well. He does in all the books, but he's deteriorating as this book goes on. So one of the things you read as you work your way through the book is you're worried about Cass, who's discovered his sister is still alive. So
gives him something to live for, which he hasn't had.
right. So anyway, they get off the hill and they arrive at a fairly nice chateau where George Patton can show up looking like a shiny new dime. And that's where whatever you're going to pursue in the rest of the book actually happens. They have this plan to pretend that they're going to Paris, but then
It's really a sting operation because
right.
At that point, the plan is not to go to Paris. So they found out that one of the leaders of the French resistance in that area is a double agent for the Germans. They don't know which one. So they want to brief them all on the plan to attack Paris, which is non-existent. And you can actually go and look at the army operational maps for that part of France up to August 20th. They all show arrows of advance going around Paris. George Patton and the Third Army are to the south, going across the Seine. U.S. First Army is going north of Paris. The British are going along the coast. Nobody's going to Paris. But then this rebellion happens, and they change. And after August 20th, all the arrows are suddenly aimed straight at Paris. And that's what they didn't anticipate. And in my story, Billy and Kaz have to chase this traitor and get to him before he gets to Paris with this news, because what was the false plan is now the real plan. And if he makes it into Paris, they have to discredit him, at least in the eyes of his spy master.
So you have a real ticking clock going on in this one, don't you? You're writing your way towards the end of the war, but you're going to take a bunch more detours. I mean, I don't want this series to stop. So I worry that we're moving along too fast.
Well, I just had a reader email me and tell me to eat more kale.
Yeah.
Because I just had my 70th birthday, and they said, well, we want you to write a lot more books all the way to the end of the war. So I do eat kale, and I am slowing this down. The last few books have happened like within days. The next book is within days. So I feel like I've got a lot of time. The next book is going to be set, not surprisingly, if you finish this book, in a secret military hospital in Great Britain, and that's where most of the action will take place.
And you've got hints of Sweden in this too, so we haven't gone.
Find out about
I'm
that.
trying to remember, did we go to Norway in any of these? Not
The
yet.
very first one.
The first one, that's right, look, but they came to England, and, because you're the Norwegian government in exile in Britain.
And in the end of that book,
Right.
really does go to.
Right, but Sweden, which was neutral, wasn't as interesting a place as Norway.
And, well, I can't give too much away about
No.
this book, but there's something going on about Sweden, and it's gonna link all the sort of loose ends, and the capture and imprisonment and mental and physical ills will be wrapped up.
Uh-huh, well, I can hardly
Can I
wait.
briefly say that my readers email me and tell me to drink more whiskey?
Well, at least you're not worrying about the Americans leaving Korea. You're in 1970 something, so they've got a huge number of
But
decades.
just wait.
I've got a few months anyway.
Well, I mean, he's not going to make a leap from 1970 to 2020, so you're not going to run out of time.
No.
And your guys, they're not aging very fast either.
I like the general idea of a fictional world in that, like Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe didn't age.
Right.
He didn't change much. He didn't have personal relationships. He was always the same guy. Sort of like Don Quixote did. Well, Don Quixote did age, didn't he? He died.
Well, Mark, your books are not sequential in the sense that we kind of never know exactly
Right.
what year it is.
Yeah,
It's very smart.
You know,
You don't have to eat so much kale. You can just-
and the editor asked me about that once, and I said, I don't know. I've been writing these guys for 30 years now, and I've never been smart enough to put it in sequence.
But I like it that way. I'm with Jim. I think it's wonderful that we just leap in and, the guys are the guys and,
It's just it's like Neverland. It's always
Yeah.
there.
But the issues are remarkably modern. I mean, even though you are writing and we've advanced over the course of your books quite decades, the stuff you're writing about still is just as resonant right now as it was, in the
Well, a lot
in
of
the
things were
70s.
happening in the early 70s. Korea was just starting to come out of it, come into its economic powerhouse. They were just starting in the 70s. They built the Seoul to Busan freeway, and that's about 200 miles, the southernmost port, Seoul to Busan. And they were so proud of that nationally. And then you saw the first high-rise buildings in Seoul started to go up. And so much started in that era for them.
Now they have one of the world's most advanced and modern airports that, and they have like better Wi-Fi than Scottsdale by an incredible amount.
Oh,
So they managed to make phenomenal progress.
I went back there in 2011. The place scared me. I mean, it's so different now. People, when I
That's
first
true all over Asia, at least in some of the
I was
cities.
telling Jim, just my lifetime, they've made 2 centuries. It took us 2 centuries, the United States, I mean, to advance as far as that. But nowadays, advancement happens so fast.
Listen, I went to Shanghai in 1997 before the Hong Kong hangover,
Mhm.
and that island that now you see is all high rises and all was nothing on it.
Mhm.
It was just an island, and Shanghai was still very much hutongs and the whole flavor of the
China.
colonial area and so forth. And if I went back now, I wouldn't even know Shanghai because it looks like Sydney. Or in fact, here's a really interesting thing. I have always wanted to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad. I was a Russian student at Stanford, and I've always wanted to go from Moscow to Vladivostok and see what it's like, and I'm imagining.
I want to go with you.
Okay, so my husband, who was fiddling around with the television, chanced upon a YouTube video of a trip on the Orient Express from Venice to London, and so that was another thing I thought would be great, except that the expense of the Orient Express is so ludicrous. Even I, who don't pay a lot of attention to that, was not really willing to do it. But I thought, well, we'll watch it, and then I'll know what it was like to. And actually, having watched it and realized that quite a lot of it's a bus trip, it lost a lot of the glamour for me. I would Istanbul to what might have been more interesting. But then we discovered that there were YouTube videos of Moscow to Vladivostok going through Ulaanbaatar. So I thought, perfect, we'll do that. So we started in Vladivostok, which looks like Shanghai, and I'm already puzzled. Ulaanbaatar also looks like Shanghai. I'm thinking we're out in the middle of Siberia, and it's going to be, it's like downtown Phoenix. It's high rises, it's glass, and then it's endless prairie, like Kansas. And I said to Rob, why do we want to do that? There's no picturesqueness anymore, and the scenery is really not terribly gripping. And maybe I've just saved 18 days, on a very expensive train. But it was a real shock to see that, even places like the capital of Mongolia have transformed themselves in this remarkable way.
Mhm.
So I don't think Seoul should be any kind of a surprise.
Well, yeah, that's why I said it in the '70s.
Right.
I go back in time. That's the biggest fun for me is I go back and I'm 25 again.
It's a time machine for you.
Who needs to bother losing weight? Just write some.
Well, I mean, it's just, both of you have just given us, these fabulous and immersive stories that take us to places that we'll never get to go now because they are back in time. Even the France that you write about is not the France that you write about, it's totally different today. But what I love is the variety of it, that, there's so many different, you've written a serial killer book, you've written bank robbery, you always vary your crimes. And the people involved, even though there's some constants like Mr. Gill and some of the 8th Army brass, but otherwise, people come and people go, and different stuff happens, and you actually could have been a career criminal if you'd wanted to be.
Well, I'm too chicken.
So you just write it out in books? Right, whereas Jim, I didn't think of your books so much as crime stories as war stories, although I think Martin has more crime in his books than you do. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, he's got the PX,
Black market.
That's a given.
Bank robbers that all.
But yeah, I think you touched on one of the tricks in a series is keeping it fresh because you have the same cast of characters. That people, you always want to see the same guys with the same characters in a series you like, but you also want something different.
Right.
That's the challenge, is keeping the elements that people really cling to and feel an emotional attachment to, and at the same time making the story different each time. 'Cause it would be easy to fall into the routine of telling the same story over and over again.
Well, the good news is that the progress of the war travels you around a very large geographic area. I'm hoping I'm remembering this right, but you wrote one book set in the Vatican, right?
Yes.
I'm not confusing you with Alan First at this point, right? And I thought that was one of your most impressive books because, the Vatican's like this big and the Nazis are right there, and there's
It's
been
such
a
closed society too. It was a
Right.
hothouse to write in.
But in miniature, it was so, and there's a lot of adverse comment about the Pope, and I thought you made, that Pope, and why he didn't do more, but I thought you made such a great case in that book for why he couldn't, because it would have jeopardized the people hiding there. They could have just stepped right over the line. There was really no physical barrier for the Nazis at all, so they could have just marched in and blown up. So your book, I thought, gave me a whole new perspective on.
And that's a case where I started off writing thinking, I'm going to write about how lousy the Pope was and about how he could have done more. And then when I started reading more and more, it's like, wow, things just got awfully complex so quickly. And that's what I love, is finding that moment where, it's not what I thought it was, and using that as a basis for the story.
Well, they've been terrific to read. Do you all have questions that you would like to ask the authors? Yes, ma'am.
I just got back from a short visit to Switzerland, and then I read The Devouring. And I have to tell you, I have never been so viscerally hit by a book in my life.
Wow.
I kept thinking, my hotel was here in the 1940s, and I know that the Gestapo stayed in it because it was a nice hotel near the train station. I just felt. Oh, anyway, all of your books hit me, but this one just, wow, you really nailed this one.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
again, that book came about only because I read a footnote in a story about, in a book about the French resistance, and the footnote was about a Zionist youth group that was smuggling children into Switzerland. And I had just never heard of that. And I just followed that, and all of a sudden I found out more than I wanted to know about the Swiss African War. So,
It was disgusting. Yeah. My other question is, where do you do most of your research?
well, most of it is online. I mean, and two great gifts are the internet and interlibrary loan, because you can get a book. What I really like getting is a contemporary book that's to the setting that I'm writing about. So I found some very esoteric stuff that public library is happy to get me, and that's almost like original source material. There's so much on the internet now that you can chase down and do research at a moment's notice. I marvel at the typewriter age. We used to write books.
I appreciate the research you do. It's excellent.
What about language facility? I mean, I remember how interested I was in your first book, now that you reminded me of it, about the Danish, the Norwegian court in London and so forth. Are some of those source materials in Norwegian? I mean, are you finding translations? What do you?
Well, I did have a little problem with translations of that poem, but other than that, I've been able to find materials that are. I just found, for the book set in Russia, I just found a book that was translated by a Russian called Criminal Russia, and it's a sort of a social history of the criminal underworld in pre-Soviet and Soviet Russia, and that has been just awesome to find. And I'm glad that somebody translated it in the 70s, because it's got all the ins and outs of the Soviet underworld and how the systems they work by. If you were, they call them thieves. They call themselves thieves, not killers or anything else. But if you were a thief and you were a member of the thieves' society, you would not do anything that the state told you. If you were in a gulag and a guard told you to open a door, you would not open the door, even if it meant you were beaten, because it was important to them to never cooperate with the state authority. And that opened a whole door for them.
And yet they love Scotland, didn't they?
Not the the criminals didn't. I'll make this real short. So there was something called the bitch wars, because the Soviets recruited criminals from the gulag to fight when they needed cannon fodder. So the ones who didn't go and fight didn't do it because they would not cooperate with the state. The ones who did ended up getting sent back to the gulag, and they were the bitches because they had cooperated with the state. So there was this huge war in the gulag that the bitches eventually won because they had come back with a lot of combat skills. It didn't work out so well for the old class. It's just, I'm sorry. The book you're just about to start working on is always the most fascinating.
Right.
So that's what's.
Because it could still be perfect,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
It always has the
No
potential.
errors.
That's right. Martin, do you need to have sources in Korean, or are you largely just dredging up your own memory? And what archives, if any, do you consult?
Well, I've done different kinds of research. I mean, I once read for one of my books, I read an anthropological study that someone had done on women in Jeju Island. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's
Yes, because Lisa C. just wrote a fabulous book about it.
but in there, the women do all the work and the men
Right.
stay home.
They do the pearl dive. It's the
Dive for oysters,
yeah.
pearls, and all
I'm
kinds of
trying to
stuff.
remember the name of her book, but those of us who read it know a lot about. Are you all familiar with Lisa C.'s most recent book? It's the island. I'll have to look it up, but it's BK. What's the name of the island of sea women? Isn't that it? Yeah. If you're interested in this at all, you should read it because it's a remarkable, and it does take place under the Japanese occupation.
Well, I already wrote that.
I I know.
Just-
Ours doesn't have any crime in it except for the crimes against the women who are
So
exploited.
I do research and like that, that anthropological study, and then I have a situation where my investigators go down to that island, and they call it the Hawaii of Korea, and where they encounter people like that and get some help from the women from the sea, and so when you're saying research, I mean, I'm sure I don't do as much as James does, because a lot of it is just from my personal, but like on this book, I didn't know about interlibrary loans other than the extent of them, what they'll get for you. I knew you could order a book, interlibrary loan, but I had read the Overseas Weekly, but I wanted, but that was years ago, and I wanted to look at it again, so I went online. I know how to do it, honestly, and I found out that Anne Bryan had her papers were at some university, I forget now, Missouri or something, and the archives of the Overseas Weekly were on microfilm, I think at the same place. So I go to the library and I says, what am I going to do? And they said, well, we can order it for you. I was flabbergasted. I really didn't. I thought I was going to have to drive there. And so a 3 weeks later, this packet, big canvas packet comes in, and they say the microfilm reader's over there after I signed. And I got to go through years worth of Overseas Weekly. And one of the things I paid attention to most, as you really do in most newspapers, was not just the pinup girls, honest, but was the advertisements. And that's really fascinating for back in those days. They had you could cut out a coupon, send in a money order, had to be a money order, they didn't trust checks, I guess. And most guys didn't have checkbooks, honestly, back in those days. And you could get a money order at the post office on base. And send it in, and then you could order an engagement ring, which they would forward to your girl back home. I thought that was particularly cute. But everything in those days was done by mail.
Listen, when I started the bookstore in 1989, we mailed out a newsletter and it had an order form in it. People sent back checks, right? You don't remember that?
Yeah.
It set us up really well for the advent of the internet. But it really wasn't that long ago that we were still doing that. It was 25 years ago you were still sending out order forms and getting back checks.
Yeah. Well, I remember when you'd enter a contest and they'd have you write a sentence 25 words or less.
Right.
You remember that?
I
People
do.
used to say that phrase all the time, 25 words or less.
Right.
I'm so happy to be with people who remember that. I say that to younger people and they go,
Right. They don't understand the write the sentence part, right? It's all Twitter, so you can't. Yeah. Now it's I've had this conversation with a number of authors. Reese Bowen, I remember when people asked her about how she researched New York City at the turn of the 20th century. It was the advertisements that meant the most to her. What kind of soap were people buying, and what kind of clothes were they wearing, and there were personal advertisements that were really, in fact, Sherlock Holmes depended on personal advertisements. I was just reading a new book by Bonnie McBird. She's going to sign here in November, and at one point, when it appears that Mycroft has been, something terrible has happened to Mycroft, and all Holmes, looks in the personals, sends out for a paper, and looks in the personals, and there miraculously, it was a personal from Mycroft, no, I know he's okay, because that whole form of communication, mail drops, which were a staple of John le Carré and Smiley and so forth, those are not around anymore. But you're still in an era where that kind of thing is happening, right?
It's because I was scared to death of the technology. As a matter of fact, when I was driving here with my son Aaron, and I'll go on this jag complaining about technology. He's heard it all before. But I was complaining. We're in the middle of the desert doing 65 miles an hour, so he can't jump out of the car. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm complaining, and he what was the word you said?
Negative?
Negative. He starts to fast forward and he goes, negative. He wants me to go forward in the conversation. Let's get to something reasonable. But yeah.
Was that his GPS to orient you?
I
And there
like
you go.
writing about what people had to do, how even the phone lines, the military had its own phone exchange.
Right.
And from a Korean phone, you had to call into the military exchange, which sometimes would be jammed up, take 20
Right.
minutes, a half hour. And then you'd talk to an operator, a human being, and they're usually Korean women who could speak and worked there for years and could speak English, and then they transfer you to wherever, the CID office or the MP station, wherever. And George and Ernie use that as an excuse all the time. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me? Well, I couldn't get through. And the fact that they can't communicate so easily means that they can do more of what they want to do.
So it's basically the same thing as disabling cell phones by having the battery run out, or, whatever, dropping it in water that you're faced with.
Exactly, but I don't really know how to disable a cell phone. I never owned one.
Well, I just gave you a clue. Right. So I think since you're here, PK, I'm going to say thank you to our video audience for watching us.